Welcome back to our special Women's World Cup series of the Engage Nation podcast. We are here and we are joined by Caroline. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm so excited for what we're going to talk about today.
I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for putting this incredible mini-series together. And I am just honored to be one of the guests that you speak with about the Women's World Cup.
Well, same goes because we are honored to have you on. So thank you. We always start with like a little bit of a brief background about you. So a bit of your story. So I would love to start with sport and women's sport in particular, where you found a passion for that, and then also where you found the drive to then start goals, because it takes obviously two separate things to be passionate about something, but then to start a business and start a company as well as a whole other ballgame.
Yes, great question. So I think I've always really been passionate about sport and women's sport. This goes back, I'm not going to give you my whole life story, but my first interaction with sport where I realized how important it was to be a woman or a girl standing up for myself in sport was when I was about 7 years old, when I was the only girl on an all-boys baseball team playing on the same team as my brother. And I remember showing up to the first game, ready to play. I was better than my brother, for being honest. And I was just so excited for my first Little League game. And we show up and the other team started teasing us because I was a girl, I was on their team, and they were saying how they were going to win the game. They were going to crush us because girls can't play baseball. Girls aren't good at baseball. Such little kid teasing and taunting. But I remember just being so frustrated. Like, why would I not belong here because I'm a girl? And so we took the field, and I just remember this so clearly. We take the field, and the first three boys up to bat hit ground balls right to me. And I throw them all out, 1, 2, 3. And I just remember walking off the field that day with such confidence, such swagger, and just this feeling like never again is anybody going to tell me that I can't do something because I'm a girl. So that was when I was 7. We're going to fast forward quite a bit, but that feeling stuck with me my whole life for the most part. And I always thought in my life I wanted to do something at the intersection of sports and business and feminism. So I got to put myself on that path, but it wasn't until the global pandemic hit in 2020 that I kind of came back to that idea of wanting to do something at the center of that Venn diagram. I was watching the 2020 WNBA season specifically and noticing everything that these incredible athletes were doing, not only from a sporting perspective, but doing from an activist perspective. They dedicated their whole season during the pandemic, their bubble season, to the Black Lives Matter movement. They were fighting for racial and social justice. They were playing elite basketball while many of them were mothers and had their children with them in the bubble during this pandemic. It was just so incredible to watch. And what I was noticing is that all of the results of the WNBA were also off the charts from a business perspective. Record viewership, merchandise, sponsorship sales. So I was just really curious about what was happening in women's sport. And I wanted to listen and learn more about the women's sports industry. So I went searching for a podcast about the business side of women's sports, and I couldn't find one, which is so frustrating. There's so many men's sports podcasts. How is there not one women's sports business podcast? There are lots of podcasts about like stories of inspirational women athletes, which are incredible. But I wanted to understand what is happening in front offices across the women's sports industry. So I'm getting there with my story, but I decided to start a podcast called The Business Case for Women's Sports to interview leaders from across the women's sports industry to talk about what they're doing in the space and ultimately make the business case for why brands, networks, and people in general should invest in women's sports. So that's how Goals started. We started as a podcast, and then after podcasting and connecting with the incredible leaders in this space, I had the idea to go fully into business. I kind of convinced myself to get into the business of women's sports. And we formed into a boutique agency to help under-resourced professional women's sports properties with their sponsorship and their marketing efforts. So that's what Goals is now. We've been in business for 3 years and just really love being in this space. And it's a really exciting time seeing the growth of women's sports. So that's a long story from when I was 7, how the fire was lit, and that's what we're doing now at Goals.
7 to now. No, it's awesome. What have you sort of seen, I guess, as obviously we're talking about the Women's World Cup, like how is it sort of the past 12 months have been really, really massive and really big for women's sports. How have you sort of seen it change a little bit, I guess, from your work?
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, So we've been fully in business at Goals. So Goals was started first as a side project, just as the podcast, while I was still working full time as the head of sponsorships at the Dick's Sporting Goods Pittsburgh Marathon in the States.
Yeah.
And when we fully went into business, it was, I want to say August of 2021. The conversations that we were having about women's sports were still very educational. It was like, we had to even just explain to people about the landscape of women's sports, that women's sports kind of existed. We had to let them know, like, this is the women's sports league. This is the team. It was all, we'd be talking to a brand trying to sell them on a sponsorship. And again, we'd have to just kind of educate them to let them know. So by the time we got done educating these brands, there was no time left to sell them and talk to them about the value proposition of women's sports. So what's been interesting over the last couple years is seeing how those conversations have shifted. No longer do we really have to educate. People understand. They understand women's sports. They were watching the World Cup. They watch the college NCAA March Madness tournament. They're watching what's going on with the WNBA. They know what's happening on a global landscape with women's sport. Now we get to get more down to business to talk about how they could get involved with women's sports. So I think that's a big shift. And, you know, just like one specific tied to the World Cup, even since this World Cup started, the engagement on our social channels has been absolutely off the charts. I want to say, Goals, we have a little over 10,000 followers on Instagram right now, which is, you know, a nice following, but we've engaged with over 3 million accounts on Instagram in the last month alone. So even if people aren't following us on Goals, they are hungry and they're interested in the content that we're putting out. So it's just been crazy to see not only the brand interest increase, but the overall fan and the interest of the general populace around women's sports.
And it's interesting because I've talked about in another episode, I've mentioned her episode many times because it was a great one with Charlotte from Copper 90, but we talk a lot about the communities that surround women's sport and how they're actually quite unique compared to, say, the men's game, because the men's game were broadcast on bars or in restaurants on Saturday. You could walk down to your local place and watch it. Whilst the women's game, you sort of had to seek it out in a different way, and it's a lot more digital and a lot more social media orientated where the communities are. I would love to see, like, a brand's engaging with that. Are they sort of understanding that there's nuances and there's differences between how they can interact with women's sport and how that also is, like, it's incredibly creative. You can sort of, the world's your oyster. You can do things in a really innovative and creative way.
Yeah, it's definitely starting to resonate. You know, for some it's not. I say this all the time with women's sports, and when you're trying to sell women's sports to a brand, it's usually no, until you get a heck yes. I'm all in. So there are definitely brands that see that value. And I think as more brands are looking to do more on social and they're looking to engage more with the digitally savvy consumer, women's sports fans or women's sports, I should say, are perfectly positioned because of our fan base being so digitally savvy. I mean, you spoke to it, but for a long time, women's sports fans had to play this kind of scavenger hunt game to consume women's sports of, can we stream it over here? Can we watch it on TV here? Can we get the score update from social media over here? You have to be a really active fan in order to be a fan of women's sports. But that translates into being really actively loyal to brands that sponsor women's sports. So that active fandom is something that's really powerful. And I think more brands are going to start to be really interested in tapping into not only that active fan base, but that really digitally savvy fan base.
It's me interesting as well. I think you talked about it, like the World Cup, and how you're seeing an incredible increase in your engagement online. I think it's just going to be interesting to see after, when it all wraps up, what goes next and where it goes, because you're going to have a really engaged audience. You're going to have really engaged consumers, and brands need to tap into it. I was talking to someone about it, like in Australia, it's obviously with the Matildas going well, it's like slowly increased and it's now on a really rapid sort of trajectory up. Like it began quite slow. Like people who knew about it were watching it. And I think the stats of the games, I think their first game that they played, the Matildas, the opening game, I think they had about an average of 2 million viewers or something like that. I can double check stats. But the most recent game, it had 6 million, which for Australia is a quarter of our population because we're quite small. So a quarter of our
Wow.
population at one point tuned into the game. And it's just amazing to think that that is the audience that brands and partners and anyone who wants to engage in women's sport and women's football in particular can access, and really, like, that is their pool. That's where they can go.
Yeah, absolutely. The numbers are there. The fandom is there. I think anybody who's not paying attention or thinking about how they could get involved with women's sports, especially on the brand side, they need to ask themselves a hard question of why aren't they seeing the value here? Because it's clear as day.
Mm. Speaking of seeing the value, can I just ask, through your experience, what have you seen around people not necessarily seeing the value? Where are their arguments, I guess, that are a bit the hesitations coming from?
Yeah,
Or
I
are
think
they
it
starting
comes
to
from,
see the value more now?
I think they're starting to see the value more now. And I think the hesitation comes from a couple places. One, I think there are some really outdated notions around the product of women's sports being an inferior product when compared to men's sports. Not as fast, not as exciting. And, that's a really easy myth to debunk. As soon as somebody watches elite women's sport, it's pretty clear that this is high level sport that is very entertaining and really fun to watch.
No, I was going to say, someone said that to me the other day. They went to one of the Women's World Cup games and they were like, oh my gosh, I was so surprised at how quick and how fast and how exciting it was. And I was like, oh gosh, like, yes, it's always been like that.
It has, but honestly, a lot of people probably have not watched women's sports or not had the opportunity to easily access women's sports. You can't become a fan of something that you're not exposed to. So if women's sports are not on TV, if you don't know how to play that fun scavenger hunt game that we talked about earlier, you may not have come across women's sports. So I like to give people the benefit of the doubt in that situation and say, all right, watch women's sports and then let's have another conversation. So I think that's one, or these outdated notions around women's sports. And then number two, it comes back to that accessibility. I think as women's sports become more accessible and people can watch it more, I think that was a huge barrier that was in place. If people aren't exposed to women's sport, they can't become a fan of women's sport. So, I think that's, if we can correct that and make women's sports more accessible, I think it's going to get easier and easier to sell.
I want to we've talked a lot about it and now we're probably going to cover it a bit more, but I really want to shift to the topic of effectively the why. Like you say, you have your podcast, A Business Case for Women's Sports. We're going to pretty much nail it today of what is the business case. Why should people put their money into women's sport? We mentioned it in our chat that we had last week, but we've seen so many reports. You've seen your reports. We saw a report from the Office for Women's Sport and Recreation out here in Australia where they sort of said that for every $1 that a company invests, they see a return of $7.29.
Amazing.
And it's things like that, which I can imagine when you probably started goals and started in this space, there wasn't that much research, and now it's sort of all coming through really thick and fast, and you're just pretty much presenting pieces of paper to people with all of your stats being like, here's the why.
100%. There was a missing data problem for a while where believers in women's sport could feel in their bones that it was good business to invest here. We knew there was something special, but we didn't have the numbers or the data to back that feeling, that hypothesis up. Now we certainly have the numbers, and we have the numbers on multiple levels. First of all, we have the numbers from a fandom perspective. So taking this World Cup as an example alone, we know opening game in Australia, you mentioned the viewership numbers, also a sold out game. 74,000 people showed up to cheer on the Matildas, the biggest soccer game or women's football game, to ever be attended in Australia. Huge. We know that the Matildas they've sold more jerseys in this World Cup that the men's team in Australia sold both during and since the 2022 World Cup. We know
I think it's been updated as well. Sorry, it's 2-1 now.
Okay,
for the Matildas jerseys.
They
just announced the other week. It's insane.
It's incredible. I mean, they're putting their money where their support is, and they're buying these jerseys. 54 million people tuned in to watch China versus England. We just know fans are showing up. So anybody who says no one watches women's sports, no one cares about women's sports, there's no market for women's sports, they're absolutely wrong, because we can point to all of these numbers and say, look at these millions, literally millions of people that are interested in women's sports. And even examples like the Jersey example, the Matildas, not only are they watching women's sports, but they're customers. They're spending money in women's sports. So that's the big one. Number one, the numbers there with the fan demand. Number two is around this research piece. So there's all this research now that has come out, and it started with in 2021, I'll say, with the Fan Project here in the States. An organization called Sports Innovation Lab did research to understand the connection between women's sports fans and the brand affinity that they feel towards brands that sponsor women's sports. And what they found is that fans of women's sports are more loyal to sponsors of women's sports and are more likely to purchase with those sponsors than that of men's sports. So they put that research out in 2021, and no research like that had ever been out before. And since then, there have been all these amazing organizations that have built upon that research and just really made it indisputable that it's good business to invest in women's sports. So you mentioned one of the reports. So the report from the Office for Women in Sport and Recreation in Victoria, Australia, that found that sponsorships of elite sport actually outperform men's when it comes to brand awareness, brand consideration, and customer conversion. And you mentioned already the $1 for every $1 corporate sponsors invest in women's sport, they see $7.29 in return, which is wild. Like, who doesn't want to spend $1 to get $7.29 back? That is such a good deal. So that was one. And then the other one that came out recently as well was a report from the collective at Wasserman, which is a global sports agency. And they found that fans of women's sports are 54% more aware of brand sponsors and are 45% more likely to purchase or consider a purchase from a brand sponsor compared to men's sports. So we have all this data that says that not only is it good business to invest in women's sports, but it's actually better business to invest in women's sports than it is to invest in men's sports. So again, it is absolutely indisputable that it's good business to invest in women's sports. So what we just try to do here at Goals is get that data, get those numbers out there and make the business case to show people, hey, not only is it the right thing to do to invest in women, in half the population, to invest in creating more gender equality in our world, but it's actually going to be good for your bottom line. It's actually a savvy business decision. Excuse me.
And what have been some of the reactions to it? Because I can imagine there's probably quite a few that are in like a little bit of a bubble almost, where they don't really understand the power and the impact of women's sports, and especially now what it has. And is it sort of like a light bulb moment for them where they're just like, oh, wow, like that is an option and that is an incredibly good business move, as we've just discussed.
Yeah, you know what? It has been, because the data and the numbers are stacking up, I have been so wonderfully surprised by the reception of all of this. It seems like this is the moment where people are actually, seeing the value, the light bulb moment, as you said.
Yeah.
It's resonating. And, I think people can have opinions. People can say, yeah, it's good business to invest in women's sports. People can have their feelings. They can be fans of things. But at the end of the day, the numbers don't lie. You can't disagree with the numbers. So if you don't like women's sports because you're just not a fan of it, okay. But if you see the numbers, you can't dispute them. You can't let your opinions override the facts that it's just good business to invest in women's sports.
It's right there. You can't really talk about anything else.
It's right there.
It's right there. What I know you've done a lot of work, and I've sort of looked into them as well, as Angel City Football Club.
Yep.
You did. Was it your master's?
Yes, I did the majority of my master's in global sport research at NYU on the Angel City Football Club in Los Angeles.
Because they're incredible with what they do. Because I love the fact that their sponsorships and their partnerships, they're more than obviously just the money that comes in. There's a lot of good that goes behind it. Like DoorDash, every goal what's the word I'm thinking of? They give out meals to those in need in the LA community and things like that. What's your sort of very general thoughts on I know we're talking about brands that are investing in women's sports, but also those that invest in the teams and actually doing good with the community and sort of using it as a platform to do more than just sort of sponsor a team and put your name on a jumper or a jersey.
Yeah. Well, what Angel City FC is doing is absolutely incredible, and it has been incredible since moment one when that team and that franchise got started. So what, you were talking about is the Angel City sponsorship model. So whenever they decided they were going to go out and seek brand partners, they wanted to do something a little bit different. They knew that, yes, they wanted to bring money in and do some good business and generate some good revenue for the organization, but they also wanted to impact the Los Angeles community in a meaningful way. So Jess Smith, who's the head of revenue at Angel City, came up with the Angel City sponsorship model, where 10% of every sponsorship deal that they signed would go back to an organization within Los Angeles. So DoorDash is a great example. Another one is Gatorade. 10% of their sponsorship with Angel City goes into coaching programs for girls in the Los Angeles community. There have been other amazing, Birdies has an internship program that they work on with them. So all of these amazing programs have popped up. And I think what Angel City has done that has worked so well for them, but also is really kind of the business proposition of women's sports, is they believe that what is right can live right alongside what is profitable. So doing good for the community is also what is good for business. So Angel City has absolutely proved that with the execution of that model. They brought in $35 million in sponsorship dollars before they even played a single game. So clearly that model resonated with the brands that they were partnering with and the brands that they were pitching to. So, I think it's just this wonderful case study that we can all look to when looking and thinking about women's sports, because again, what is right lives alongside what is profitable with women's sports. Doing the right thing, investing in women's sports and gender equality in the sports space is a good business move. So I think that's the really special legacy of Angel City FC, and also the really special thing about women's sports.
I know, it's a perfect example where, I think it's like you say, what is profitable can also live alongside what is good for the world. I love it. I know that you did your research on it, so that's why I had to ask you on it, because I know how much you love it as a club and what it represents as well.
I do. Anytime I can talk about Angel City, I am just such a fan of everything they've done. It's such a great case study, not just in women's sport, but in sport in general, with how they've built their business. So we can talk about it for days. I wrote 40 to 50 pages on it for my master's thesis. So there's a lot more where that came from.
You are Angel City aficionado. You know everything.
I do my best. When I was getting graded on it, I had to. So it's a lot of fun to learn about.
You touched on the legacy, obviously, of Angel City and what they mean as a sports club. But I think if we go back to the World Cup, what do you sort of see the legacy of the World Cup being for sponsorship and things like that?
Yeah, I think we talked about it already. I think this World Cup, we're going to come out of it with the indisputable proof that it's good business to invest in women's sports. Again, the fandom, the data around the mass quantities of women's sports fans that we have, I think that's, number one. Anyone who says no one cares about women's sports, you can't say that anymore because of the numbers around this World Cup. The globe, the entire world has stopped to see what's going on with this World Cup, and it's been pretty exciting. So I think number one, all the research that's come around also supports that, number one. Number two, I think this is a really interesting moment to see the connection between quality broadcast and coverage and the business results. So it's been great to see how Fox in the States has really invested in the product of the Women's World Cup. And they've treated this World Cup like the marquee event that it is, with incredible coverage of every single game. There's reporting from not only them, but multiple sports media and mainstream media outlets on the World Cup. And it all comes back to that accessibility piece. So when we do market and broadcast and make women's sports accessible, the business results are inevitable. So anybody who I have always lived by that kind of belief that if we make women's sports accessible, more people can watch. And if more people can watch, more can become fans. And if more can become fans, brands and networks are going to invest more. And then if networks can invest more, then women athletes are going to get paid more. So it's just this cycle.
Yeah.
And so this World Cup is showing us, yeah, that cycle works. If you make women's sports accessible, more people watch, then we can make the business case that it's indisputably good business to invest in women's sports.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting. So you said, just because I'm not entirely sure, but so Fox in America, they're broadcasting every single game. They've broadcast every single game of the World Cup.
They have, and that's included pre-game shows, post-game shows, investment in pundits and commentators. They've treated it like any major men's sporting event, but we're seeing it with the Women's World Cup. And yeah, with it, we're seeing so many people tuning in and becoming more interested in these storylines and these games. So it's been incredible to see.
That's amazing. And so then I guess my final question for you, which is going to probably sum up a little bit of this topic and everything that we've talked about, but what is your business case for investing in women's sports? Like, why should we do it? Your pitch, your elevator pitch.
My elevator pitch. That's a great question. This is how I end all my podcast episodes, is I ask our guests to summarize in a few sentences why they think it's good business to invest in women's sports. This is a hard question to answer, especially because I think I'm kind of a broken record at this point. I've said it so many times, but the short of it is, with women's sports, what is right lives alongside what is profitable. It's good business to invest in gender equity. We know all the benefits that sport can bring, especially to women and girls. It has the power to change lives, to instill confidence, teach a lot of life skills, leadership. We know the stats that 94% of C-suite executives in the States played sport growing up. So literally girls who play sports become women who lead. We know there are so many great benefits to investing in women's sports. And now we also know that it's good business as well. So it's a classic win-win. So that's my pitch. Anybody who wants to get involved with women's sports, it's a win-win. You can't lose. It's good on every front. So that's my business case in 1 minute or less.
That is good. That is awesome. I love it. And then actually, this is the final question that I've asked everyone in this podcast that we'll sort of all wrap up in. But where do you see women's football? And obviously, because we talked about women's sport more generally, we can broaden this to women's sport. Where do you see it in 5 years, in 10 years, and then well into the future? Where do you see it going? What does it look like?
Yeah. I mean, hopefully we see it on an equal playing field with men's sport. I'd love to see all of the gender gaps across sport closed. We know women's sport receive less than 10% of media coverage, only 1% of sponsorship dollars. We know that only 14% of sports journalists are women. Only 7% of professional team owners are women. The pay gaps across sport are vast. The highest paid player in the NBA makes $51 million a year. The highest paid player in the WNBA makes $234,000 a year. So those pay gaps are incredibly vast. All of the gender gaps are vast. So I guess I wish, and I think what we're going to see in 5 to 10 years are those gaps starting to close. I don't think we're going to necessarily reach 50-50, but I think we're going to see more brands step up, more networks step up to close those gaps. A really interesting case study here in the States is Ally Bank, who is the title partner of our podcast. Ally last year made a pledge, their 50-50 pledge, to even out their spending in media between men's and women's sports. So they're looking to spend 1-to-1, 50-50 with whatever they spend in men's sports, they're going to spend it in women's sports. And they've made a call to action to other brands to do the same thing. So we're seeing this brand intervention to try to close some of those pay gaps. So kudos to Ally with what they're doing, but it's going to be great to see other brands step up to do similar things. And so I think we're going to see those gaps starting to close out. And then, one thing that I think is really exciting with women's sports is we're just getting started in a lot of ways. So there's not a ton of room for men's sports to expand or grow or add new teams or have new leagues. But with women's sports, there's so much white space. There's so much opportunity. So I think we're just going to see so much more of women's sports, new leagues popping up, new teams popping up, new tournaments popping up. So, you know, the sky is the limit. There's not a ton of room for men's sports to grow, but there's so much room for women's sports to just do more. And so from a fan perspective, it's just a really exciting time. So, you know, there's going to be a lot that changes over the next 5-10 years, again, because we are still kind of in startup mode over here. So I truly can't wait to see. But what I believe is that this progress is just going to continue, and we're just going to keep seeing women's sports grow and grow.
And I love how you mentioned, they've got the space to grow. They've also, now we know that they've got the fans and they've got the people, the supporters involved, that they have the space to grow. There's millions of people watching this tournament and watching other tournaments all across the world. So the world is their oyster.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, that is everything. Thank you so much for coming on. It has been awesome. A wonderful way to round out this podcast series. I've enjoyed it so much, so thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you again for doing this. Thanks for having me, and can't wait to chat women's sports with you again sometime.
I know, I'll have to fly over to the States sometime soon. Come for a visit.
Or maybe I need to come to you. It'd be fun to be over there right now. I'm jealous that you're in the thick of it.
It's good fun. It's good fun.